let's get started here. So, today's Thursday, May 30th. This is our third from the last gathering that we're going to have together collectively before you have your final assignment of doing your paper, which we'll talk about some at the end of class today. But we had on Tuesday started talking about in part 3 of the course the role of the indigenous or tribal people around the planet in potentially stopping global climate change, and the degree to which these activities, as of today, have been effective or not in actually stopping global climate change. We realized that the issue of the role of the indigenous people in their resistance is really a resistance against, as we talked about last week, and we've been talking about in the first 2/3 of the course, is to resist the ongoing offensive, which is still underway on the part of an elite white, Caucasian, usually male group of a tiny percentage of people who own the stock in and run the major oil and fossil fuel companies or corporations. In that we've reviewed the information that's available and pointed out that they see this petroleum being a source of their military and economic power to, as they put it in their own words, maintain their continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials on the planet over and above the petroleum, which is all being directed toward their ability to assert and exercise what they refer to as full spectrum dominance over the rest of the planet, all other nation states and all other group actors who might in any way attempt to interfere in their ability to maintain this continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials, and that their effort is to also maintain, or what they refer to as to ensure the continued security, energy security of Western civilization against, one would obviously conclude, the eastern portion of the world, which is now China, in this rising Asian empire. That's really what their mission is since the end of the Cold War, and they've articulated that very clearly. And I've pointed out some of the language from the first and second drafts of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document, as well as Samuel P. Huntington's major work, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. We were just beginning to outline some of the issues that are involved in this larger issue of the role of indigenous people in potentially participating in stopping global climate change, which is the direct proximate result of the massive burning of fossil fuels. And we had hit upon a number of issues that you might not have otherwise acknowledged or recognized. And the first of these was that the indigenous tribal peoples of the world that we're talking about are not limited to North American Indians, such as the Great Sioux Nation or the Lakota people or the Apaches or the Navajo or the Mohawks and others that you've heard about, but that they also include the indigenous tribal people of Vietnam and the Middle East, various Middle Eastern tribal societies that have been extant for tens of thousands of years. And they include African tribes in Nigeria that have risen up in opposition to the Royal Dutch Shell drilling there. in Central America as well, in Ecuador specifically, as well as in Mexico. And of course, most recently, as you know, in Venezuela, that we know that it was the coming to power of the indigenous people in the election of what's his name? Nope. What? Chavez. There it is. See, that when Chavez was one of the very first genuinely indigenous people to rise to a position of power in any of the major nation states. And he in fact began right away utilizing the domestic oil in his country to not only spread the wealth out among the people in their country, but he began to actually pay off the debts of other South American countries that had become indebted to the World Bank and to the International Monetary Fund, that had all been targeted by this tactic that had been adopted by the Western elite, and that is explored in John Perkins' book, An Economic Hitman, in which he talks very clearly about there having been this conscious plan on the part of the elite in the United States to basically encumber these South American nation states with major debt by foisting upon them through manipulating the people that they'd put into power in their governments down there, to get them to accept the argument that they needed more development in their country, that it wasn't sufficient to have the indigenous people living on sustainable farms and subsistence farms and being able to raise their families in the countryside, that they needed to have more industry. They needed to, therefore, have a lot more electricity to run the factories, and therefore they needed to have hydroelectric dams built. And so they had to take out loans. The country, the nation state, had to take out loans from the World Bank and to repay the International Monetary Fund large interest rates on these loans. And therefore, in order to get the people to come up off their local farms to come into work in these factories, that what they were doing is they were seizing the land by eminent domain, the leaders of the nation states down there, and that they were commandeering the land and using them to grow sugar beets and cut flowers and sugar cane and other type of exportable products, so they could generate a cash flow for their country, and then they could use that cash to pay off the loans and the interest on the loans. And what happened is when Chavez came to power in Venezuela, he actually began to use the income. He refused to allow the oil inside Venezuela to be exploited by foreign oil corporations. And what he did is instead they had their own national oil corporation, and when they were selling oil on the international market, they were distributing the wealth by paying off the loans of other countries in South America. This, of course, generated a major effort on the part of the American Central Intelligence Agency to undermine the Chavez government, and they infiltrated and instigated challenges to them, just as the American Central Intelligence Agency had done earlier in Cuba to try to stop the new Cuban revolutionary government that had come to power in January of 1959 from having any diplomatic relations with China or Russia. And the same thing that they had done to Chile when Allende had come to power and was attempting to establish a social democratic or democratic socialist economy, a mixed economy in Chile. And so the point I'm making is that the coming to power of genuine indigenous people in Venezuela had caused them to be attempting to do something entirely different than just to pursue the short-term economic self-interest of their own country, because they had a greater sense of relationship and community with the other indigenous people in South America. So that's the first point that we were pointing out when we're having this discussion about the role of the indigenous people in potentially stopping global climate change, that there were, by indigenous people, we mean a lot more than the North American, Native American people. The second point that we were raising at the end of a class was that there are a whole range of methods that have been employed by indigenous people to resist the exploitation of their resources, in this particular case having to do with petroleum largely, and that these types of tactics that have been deployed by them have varying ranges of success, but that there's a whole spectrum of these kind of tactics that were adopted. You start out with the first level of tactics that we talked about, which are those that are totally peaceful and pacifist, that have to do with government licensed demonstrations, public demonstrations, that they apply for permits. They're given particular areas where they can demonstrate that don't threaten any type of actual physical interference with the ongoing activities of the elite and attempting to exploit their petroleum. They include marches, public marches, and cross-country runs to try to attract attention. They write letters to the editor. People write books about it. They hold prayer vigils. They engage in lobbying of their own state legislatures or national legislatures to try to protect the environment and the people against the ravages of the oil and fossil fuel exploitation. And they then often resort to litigation, actually attempting to drag those oil corporations into court and undertake depositions against them to dig out the evidence showing the knowledge on the part of these executives in these oil corporations that they're radically despoiling all of the natural resources of the people there, and that they know that they're in fact causing global climate change. So not just having an immediate short-term impact on the local environment of the indigenous people, but actually having an adverse impact on the entire global climate system. And then there are boycotting. They've organized boycotts of the products of the petroleum company, and they also engage in major campaigns for divestment. They try to get people around the world to divest, that is to withdraw their financial support for these corporations and financial institutions that are supporting them. So we were pointing out that there's a whole range of completely peaceful, pacifist, lawful activity that the indigenous people have engaged in to try to push back against some of this exploitation of their oil and fossil fuel resources. But there's another level that they go to, which is sort of a middle level of resistance. They engage in physical sit-ins. For example, they trespass right onto the land where usually the state or the nation have given permission illegally to the oil corporations to go in and under license to exploit the oil. And no matter what they're doing to despoil the environment, the legislators or the executive branch officials in that nation have authorized that activity. Not unusually, because there's large amounts of money being paid to those legislators by the oil corporations and fossil fuel corporations to authorize them to do this. And so that people, when they realize this, they move to this middle level of resistance, which is actually going in and, for example, sitting in right in the pathway of these pipelines. Or they go in and they occupy the territory where they want to do the drilling. And they often, people will, for example, chain themselves to the bulldozers that they're brought in to try to dig up the area and prepare it for the drilling and exploitation. This happened, for example, when we were out doing the Karen Silkwood case out in Oklahoma back in 1978 and 79. Much to our surprise and chagrin, we discovered that while our whole Silkwood team was there in Oklahoma City doing the litigation, there was an attempt to build the largest private nuclear power plant in the entire United States, right there in Oklahoma. Interestingly enough, at a place, the native name for which was the Mutated Fox. And we found out about this, and our whole crowd of people went out there and actually built a ramp. They had put this big barbed wire fence all the way around the facility where they'd put up these wind towers. When they're getting ready to build a nuclear power plant, for example, they put up these little propellers on the top of a great big tower that is gauging the wind, so they'll know in which direction the radioactivity will blow when it starts leaking from these facilities. And they want to determine at least what the pathway of it is, usually so they can do studies to see how much cancer rates are being generated downwind from these things. And we found out about this, and people called us and kept asking us what this thing was, and our people happened to know what it was. So our people all went out there, and when they got to this great big huge barbed wire fence with all the razor wire and stuff over it, what they did is they built a great big set of ramps and trucked them in and rolled them up to the fence, and everybody just walked up these big long ramps and down the other side onto the property and chained themselves to the bulldozers with carborundum chains. And so when the much anticipated arrival of the local sheriffs came, they came in and they tried to saw the chains off and were breaking all of their saws. And so that they had to go get a whole bunch more. And so during that time, our people were completely peaceful and kept telling the sheriffs and the police, do you know what this is? They're getting set to build a major private nuclear power plant here. And the reason they have these little whirly gigs up there is because they're going to be blowing radiation down on you guys. And all the police were shocked. They had never heard anything about it. And so they eventually ended up joining with us. And they arrested us all, including the 1-year-old baby of Patty Austin, my secretary, who I think still holds the record of being the youngest criminal charged with felony trespass onto a sensitive infrastructure. But anyway, we were all acquitted. They dismissed all the charges later. But this kind of thing, which is kind of a middle-level activity, it's not completely licensed by the state. It's not authorized by the local officials. You're in certain defiance of their juridical authority. But you demonstrate that you're willing to ratchet it up a little bit because you're completely outraged by the comparative ineffectual results of your peaceful demonstrations against them. And this is also taken the form, as you know, of tree sitting. Has happened now. The Earth First people, what they do is when they realize that they're going to be cutting down a bunch of forests that actually put oxygen up into the atmosphere and take the carbon dioxide out, they actually get up in the trees and sit and tie themselves to the trees and keep the trees from being cut down. These are some examples of sort of a middle-level activity to try to stop the people from exploiting these resources that are all contributing to global climate change. Because in addition to trying to stop the drilling of the oil and the burning of the oil and the mining of the fossil fuels of coal, et cetera, and the fracking for natural gas, there's also this issue of protecting the forests that are instrumental in, let's say, drawing down the carbon out of the atmosphere and generating oxygen. So these are all part of the whole environmental protection movement. Then when that doesn't work, there's another level, what we call high-level resistance that we were talking about. And this includes so-called monkey wrenching, as it's referred to. And what this involves is, for example, when when the ski resort in Vail in Colorado were deciding they were going to put in a brand new ski jump for their entertainment. And we're going to be cutting down a whole big bunch of forests to do this. When they built the very first portions of the ski ramp, and somehow mysteriously during the night, someone came in with wrenches and screwdrivers and disassembled the entire thing, undid all the bolts and things, and just took it all down and walked away with all of the ski jump, actually. And the people went crazy, saying these are thieves. They've stolen our ski jump, and that they've engaged in this horrible attack on private property. And so it stepped up to a kind of a whole new level. And so that there are others. For example, Sam Lovejoy, a man who shall live in fame forever. Frank Lovejoy, when he found one of these nuclear towers with the little spinners on the top, they're so far up into the sky, they have to have these big wires, these big cables like that hold the thing up in the air. And Frank Lovejoy, or Sam Lovejoy, went and cut them all down. He cut the cables, and so the whole tower collapsed. And he was on the most wanted list for a long time. The FBI were completely beside themselves trying to find Sam Lovejoy, and he became kind of a cultural hero around the United States, and used to appear for speeches and stuff like that. And he'd get done doing the speech, and then the police would all come running into the place after he'd already left. And the same thing happened with the Berrigan brothers that you may have heard of, Father Daniel Berrigan and Phil Berrigan, Liz McAllister, a Catholic nun, and others. And what they were doing in this particular case, opposing the Vietnam War, that you probably heard, they would sneak into the draft board, the National Draft Board. They would sneak into the draft board office during the day, and one of them would hide out somewhere in the building. And then when the place closed down that night, they would wait until everybody was completely gone, and then they would come out of hiding and unlock all the doors. And in the Berrigan brothers gang would come, and they would rifle through all of the selective service files, and they would take them outdoors and pour their own blood on them and light them on fire. And that became a major form of entertainment back during the opposition to the Vietnam War, and it was making the selective service people crazy about this. And they put Father Dan Berrigan and Phil Berrigan on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, and they would go around celebrating Mass Sunday mornings all around the country, and delivering homilies against nuclear weapons and against the war. And then they would always get ushered away, and they would take off just before the FBI would come swarming into the building in SWAT teams, to try to find them. This was another kind of form of direct action. And this would also include disabling the vehicles that were being brought in to start exploring for oil and drilling for oil. And in addition to, instead of just sitting in the pathway or chaining yourself to the bulldozers, these people that had gone to high-level direct action against these oil corporations would actually destroy the vehicles. They would actually go in and break all of the instruments out of the bulldozers. They would cut their tires and flatten the tires of all these trucks and stuff like this. I don't mean to laugh, but it's only because it's so funny. And they would do these types of things, and this is actually considered property destruction. It wasn't of the passive kind where they would just unscrew the thing and take it away. They would actually wreck these things. Okay, and now I was called in, for example, slightly a different thing. That out in Wyoming, there was a plan during the Carter administration. There was a proposal to build these big underground tunnels to move nuclear missiles around, so that they couldn't get hit by Soviet missiles that could tell where the silos were, and they could attack. So what they did, they had these missiles, what they call them, mobile missiles, they call them anyway. what they would do is they would have them on these big like train cars, and they were going to build a whole long series of tunnels under the ground in New Mexico, in Nevada, in Arizona, in these big open areas. And then they were going to shuttle these missiles around so that the Soviets from their satellites couldn't tell where they were. Well, in the meantime, they were going to be destroying the water in the area and using up all the sand and cement and water and ruining everybody's land. And so I was asked to chair a meeting of the people from those areas, and a major alliance was formed between the farmers and the ranchers and the Native American indigenous people. And we had a whole long day of discussions about what should be done about all this, and finally the Native American leaders started standing up one by one saying, I have a hunting rifle, and if anybody tries to come on to my land or our land with these, we can shoot the tires out of these trucks where they're coming in to load in the sand and all of that. And this has escalated considerably. And then the ranchers, white ranchers and farmers said, yeah, we've got rifles too. And they actually got all the way to the point of discussing basically armed opposition to these people. And I had the good fortune of being asked to appear at a local television station to announce what the decisions were that were being made by this gathering. And I told them, I said, look, if they try to come in here, there are going to be people that are going to take up arms against them. And they'd better be ready for this if they're planning to do this. And it turns out that they scuttled the entire project because they knew that the local people, farmers and ranchers and indigenous people, were willing to take up arms against them. And they were not ready to go to that level. And they weren't prepared for that type of bad press, that problem they were going to have. So that is a what they call high level direct action against them. And then it moves up to an even higher level, and this is where we started getting more uncomfortable during the discussion at the end of the last Tuesday's discussion. Then you have the entire question of direct anti-materiel violence, and not just the breaking the dials and stuff on a bulldozer or cutting their tires and stuff, but this is actually blowing things up. This is mounting a type of an insurrection against the authorities and the corporations, where people will actually go in and set things on fire, or they'll blow them up, and they'll start using guerrilla tactics against these people. So as you see this kind of escalating levels of direct action against these oil corporations and coal mining corporations, et cetera, it's obvious that the variable that really determines what level of direct action people are willing to take against these activities has to do with how directly threatened they feel. And if they feel that their very existence is threatened, then they're willing to go to much greater lengths to stop this from happening. There are other people much farther away who kind of may be abstractly opposed to the M1 missiles, or they may be opposed to the drilling of the oil in the middle of indigenous territory, and they may be willing to write a letter to their congressman. They may be willing even to divest some of their investments in Wells Fargo. But they wouldn't be willing to go to these kind of lengths until and unless they thought that they were personally directly threatened, they and their families, for example. But the thing that distinguishes the indigenous people is that their families and their lives are at stake. They are in the territory where the actual massive damage, the immediately observable damages, are being inflicted. So that they see these big oil wells pumping out the stuff from the oil, these bilges that come out and contaminate all of their streams. They see the smut going up into their atmosphere. It's their homes that are covered with the waste that is thrown up into the air from these kind of activities. It's their air that can't be breathed. It's they who suffer the consequences of these man camps that are brought in by these oil corporations, where they bring in these big box cars and they set up housing for these roughnecks that they bring in from around the country, virtually all of them white, blue-collar people, and they bring them in, and there's violence that surrounds a lot of these man camps, the disappearance of young women, et cetera. It's a very major thing that goes on. And so that the people themselves decide, the local indigenous people decide that they're not going to stand for this, because this is their lives. This is the lives of their family. And this is the health of their own physical lands. And so the people are willing to go to much greater lengths to stop that type of intrusion. And so you see them ratcheting up the level of direct action that they're willing to take to stop these types of oil drilling and exploitation of their resources. So this was one of the issues that we touched upon at the end of class last Tuesday, and we also pointed out a third thing in addition to the identity of the tribal indigenous people being more expansive than you might have thought. The levels of direct action that people are willing to go to escalates in accordance with the degree of existential threat that one experiences as a result of them. But thirdly, we got to the point of recognizing that white people who are part of the Caucasian race, that are principally the beneficiaries of this type of maintenance of a privileged access to the petroleum resources around the world, and beneficiaries of the type of technology that is engined by the petroleum, that the white people are often willing to be allies, but they almost uniformly don't become committed to doing anything more than just the first or second level. They'll walk in, they'll march in protests, and they'll write letters, and they'll even help fund litigation, and they'll do a lot of these completely lawful things, but they dread the whole idea of ever being considered to be engaged in unlawful activity, because there's been a very effective campaign that has been mounted through the public schools to train white people instinctively that you cannot possibly go outside of the law, that the law is there to protect you, and that therefore if you want to have the protection of the law, you have to abide by the law. And so that there's a very high level of effectiveness of the American educational system training white people and white students not to consider going outside of the law, and to the extent to which the type of threat that the white people are experiencing is only tangential, or at least long term, and they don't recognize it as an immediate existential threat. They aren't willing to really go past the first or second level of opposition to these. And the oil corporations know this. And their security forces know this, and that they bank on that, because the reality is that they really, at the present time, would not be prepared to deal with a real major insurrection of any kind on the part of major amounts of white people joining together with the indigenous people to protect against the immediate short-term damages that are being visibly inflicted upon the indigenous people. Because the white people still don't grok the fact that they're being injured, and that these activities constitute, in fact, an existential threat against them. So that their opposition to this type of oil drilling and fossil fuel burning and all that remains a theoretical thing. It remains an ideological position. It remains kind of an abstract belief or a philosophy, but it isn't real. It doesn't rise to the level of an immediate threat to their existence, and so they aren't motivated adequately to do anything else. So we had just gotten to the question, and we ended the class on Tuesday of, how far will white people be willing to go to become allies with the indigenous people? If the indigenous people begin to rise up to protect their own homelands and their own families and children in their own immediate environments against this type of massive exploitation, how far are white people willing to go to support them? And what I want to do is today I want to deal with two particular subjects in this vein. One of them, of course, is going into the details of what has been done so far stateside with regard to the indigenous people in the Dakotas to try to oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline and what they're preparing to do to oppose the Keystone XL pipeline. I want to address those things, but I want to do a quick update before we turn our attention to that, to deal with an update on the Trump impeachment. Now, how many of you here saw the entire 10-minute presentation by Mueller yesterday? One. Okay. So let me tell the rest of the class basically what it is that happened. Won't take 9.5 minutes. And that is that Robert Mueller, the author of the 2-volume investigative report that was issued almost 2 months ago now, that he came out suddenly and made a public statement. He appeared in the press room of the Department of Justice, and he came out and he said just a few very important things. Number one, he said, in effect, look at Attorney General Barr publicly stated that the reason that I did not file any criminal charges against President Trump for his obstruction of justice was because I didn't find adequate evidence to support such charges. That is not true. The reason that I did not bring criminal charges against Donald Trump for obstruction of justice is because of the White House policy paper that had been prepared, which generated internal Justice Department guidelines prohibiting me from criminally indicting a sitting president. Okay? And that's why I didn't. And what I did instead is I laid out the evidence showing what evidence there is to support a charge of obstructing of justice in 10 different specific instances. And it is under our Constitution up to others to make the decision as to whether or not to charge the president with criminal activity. Never did say, I'm talking about Congress. I'm talking about the House Judiciary Committee. He didn't say that. But it was perfectly clear to everybody who heard it that that's what he was talking about. Okay? So that's number one. And what he said also is he said, I would like to congratulate all of the people that were involved in this investigation. They are all people of very high integrity, that it was perfectly clear that we had complete legal and constitutional justification in initiating and undertaking this investigation, including the investigation not only of the Russian interference in our 2016 election, but also our investigating the Trump campaign and investigating the president for potential obstruction of justice. He said all of those things were completely constitutionally supported, thereby pushing back against Trump, who is now insisting that there were corrupt motives initiating this particular investigation, that it was simple political bias against him, citing a couple of the FBI people that were involved initially before they were dismissed from the Mueller team. Their comments about not allowing him to become president or stay in there. So he secondly pushed back against Trump's statements and Barr's investigation that is going on right now, where he is attempting to investigate the origins of the investigation. So those two things are extremely important, that he, in the first instance, basically handed the ball to Congress, saying, look, here's the evidence of the obstruction of justice. This was a completely constitutionally authorized investigation. This is the evidence. The only reason I didn't indict the president is because I can't do so because of this regulation inside the Justice Department. And I was an employee of the Justice Department. And I am hereby resigning, which he did. He resigned yesterday. And said that this, and then he said, thirdly, this is all I'm going to say about it. So if the Congress or anyone attempts to subpoena me and bring me in to try to ask questions about things any further, like, for example, without saying so, did I mean that Congress should be investigating him for impeachment now? I'm not going to answer questions like that. This report is speaking for me. That's all I'm going to say. So if you try to subpoena me and bring me in, it's not going to be productive because I'm not going to say anything other than what I've said here. And what I'll do is I'll read you the pages, and so he did that as well. Okay. Now the response of CNN and MSNBC, and surprisingly, even some of the commentators on Fox News actually said that it was perfectly clear that Mueller was intending to turn this report over to Congress, to have Congress begin impeachment procedures against Trump. And so virtually everyone has said now that we are much farther down the road toward the impeachment of Donald Trump today than we were prior to yesterday's comments by Mueller. Okay, so so that in addition to that, he blunted, or may have blunted, the impetus for the Barr investigation at the behest of Trump, investigating the origins of the investigation. Now, that cuts both ways, as you know, for us, because I was perfectly happy to have them investigating why it is that the FBI secured the FISA warrant against Carter Page. Because I think the more digging that's done on Carter Page and in his meetings with Igor Sechin, the better. Because there are many reasons that we've outlined earlier to suspect that there was, in fact, a quid pro quo arrangement made between Carter Page as a member of Trump's National Security Advisory Committee and Igor Sechin, the chief executive officer of Rosneft, the nationally owned oil and gas company of Russia. There's every reason to believe that there was a quid pro quo agreement that 20%, 19.5% of all of Rosneft would be sold to Trump and his associates if, in fact, he were elected and he, in fact, took steps to remove the sanctions against Russia that had been imposed on Russia by the Obama administration as a result of the incursion into eastern Ukraine by Russia to take control of Crimea. And later, additional sanctions that were imposed by the Obama administration on the grounds that they said that Russia was interfering in our 2016 election. So that in this quid pro quo would constitute the very type of agreement that Mueller in Volume 1 said that he was unable to find. He was saying that the standard for Volume 1 was not the term collusion with Russia on the part of the Trump campaign. He said there was plenty of coordination, a lot of solicitation, a lot of openness and willingness on the part of the members of the campaign to accept the interference of Russia. But then he went on to say, outside of his report, which he said in the statement yesterday, he wants to emphasize how clear it is that Russia did, in fact, intrude into our election. And he did so specifically, and he didn't even say to assist Trump in getting elected. What he said was to denigrate one of the two candidates. That is, of course, Hillary Clinton. And so he's still kind of gingerly walking around this thing with Mueller. But what this does is it raises a potential additional grounds for impeachment. And that is Trump's insistence on refusing to do anything to stop Russia from intervening in the election in 2020. That this is a failure, indeed a refusal on his part to take steps to protect the electoral process in the government of the United States against a direct criminal assault on the part of the Russian GRU, the Russian military intelligence. So that's another major factor in the statement that was issued by Mueller yesterday, that he's raised the specter of an entirely additional grounds for impeachment in the failure on the part of Trump, to fulfill his constitutional obligations under his oath of office to protect the people of the United States against foreign attacks. Okay, so I wanted to get all of that out in front of us because we've been monitoring that stuff through the whole second third of the course here. And those developments yesterday are extremely important. And even though you may not have been as intensely monitoring the reports on this thing since the end of the second part of the course, I just wanted to get that out in front of you so you know the latest and what its implications are. Okay? Now, the second thing that I want to do today, of course, I guess before leaving that subject, I should point out that the response on the part of the Democratic Party people is important. The response to Mueller's statements, and it's clear now that another dozen Democratic Congress people have now publicly stated that they want the impeachment resolution to be begun now in the hearings for impeachment. And so this puts additional pressure on Nancy Pelosi to try to continue her drumbeat of saying that, look, we do not want to have hearings begin officially under the auspices of engaging in an impeachment inquiry. We have all kinds of authority to engage in hearings, to get the information. And it's clear what she wants to do, as many of you pointed out in your papers that you were aware of, that she's wanting to gather the evidence publicly for the people who aren't going to read the 448-page report, to present it in dramatic form, and to have direct witnesses come forward and testify about the acts of obstruction on the part of President Trump. And that she thinks that may well lead to the return of articles of impeachment when the country has come to that general state of consciousness. And she is still looking for more and more Republicans in the House and Senate to jump ship and be willing to call for his impeachment. And as of now, there's only one such person, one junior congressman from Colorado. But no other Republicans have come over yet. And so what Nancy Pelosi is saying, let's put it to them. let's put it to them, building up more and more and more of this public evidence now in public testimony, and then identifying the congressmen people and the senators who will not do anything about it in the election in 2020. So that's the update on what happened there. And so what I want to do now is I want to give you a sort of an update on what the level of opposition is on the part of the indigenous people here in the United States, in North America, against the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone XL pipeline. So you'll see that there was a full panoply of the first two levels of opposition. The strictly lawful, licensed, preferred forms of opposition to the pipelines going forward, and even secondly, into that second group of some kind of unlawful activity they were willing to take. Yes?
Just before moving on to that, I know the legislature was having some difficulties enforcing the subpoenas they were getting to gather this witness public testimonies. Do you know what the status is in the judiciary in enforcing that?
Yes, there have been two opinions, the federal district court opinions, in two of them in the District of Columbia. One of them has ruled that Trump has to turn over his tax returns to the Government Oversight Committee that has demanded them, because it says so on the face of the statute, saying that when the chairman of the House Oversight Committee demands the tax returns of any party, they shall be turned over to him. And so that the federal district court judge not only ruled in favor of him having to turn over the tax, but he basically ridiculed the position of the White House in Trump, saying that this is not even a close question. There's no merit whatsoever to their entire opposition. And the second one is that they have ruled that, the second judge has ruled that the documents that have been subpoenaed by the Judiciary Committee, other documents, not the redacted portions of the Mueller report, but other documents that they have subpoenaed from the White House need to be turned over. And so that the Democrats are 2 for 2 on the actual judicial rulings that they've obtained. Now, needless to say, the administration and Trump are just going to appeal it to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And then they would appeal any adverse ruling there to the United States Supreme Court. And so they're going to be running right into the teeth now of Judge Roberts. Justice Roberts is going to be wanting to play the role of the swing vote, taking the place of Justice Kennedy. Even though Kavanaugh technically replaced him, everybody knows that Kavanaugh is now part of the usual 5-person reactionary majority on the Supreme Court. Justice Roberts is, however, concerned to some degree. People may be giving him more credit than he deserves on this, but he realizes that if, in fact, the court constantly just rubber stamps whatever it is that Trump and his supporters want the Supreme Court to do, that it's going to undermine the credibility of the United States Supreme Court. And he has, as the Chief Justice, some institutional concerns about the health of the judicial system. If it becomes known to the people of the United States that they're functioning as a rubber stamp for the executive branch or the Trump administration, that it is bad for the long-term health of the constitutional system. And so Roberts there's only one instance in which he's done this so far, and that is his refusal to strike down the Obamacare legislation. That the 4 other reactionaries all demanded that it be overturned. All 4 of the moderates on the court said no, and Justice Roberts went along with the moderates. But that just because he knew perfectly well that even the American people would recognize that as being completely biased. And so these rulings are on their way up to Justice Roberts right now, and the opinions were extremely strong in both cases, trying to plug every hole of a possible level of appeal on these things. And very importantly, they fast-tracked those decisions. Those decisions came out within the same week that the actions were filed. And so that there may be similar fast-tracking on the part of the three-judge panel that's going to review them at the D.C. Circuit, then there may be a full en banc review of all the justices, and then it'll go to the Supreme Court. So this may be, those things may be taking place right here in the early month of summer. And so this issue now arises is the key one is going to be the subpoena of McGahn. The subpoena of Don McGahn, the legal counsel for Trump in the White House, the White House counsel, is the guy who has already given some 30 hours of testimony to the special prosecutor's staff and told of firsthand eyewitness under oath knowledge of these specific actions taken by Trump to obstruct the investigation, including ordering McGahn to get the Attorney General to fire Mueller. So he is at the present time under orders from Trump not to testify, citing executive privilege, which is not the worst of all arguments. You know, I mean, that's part of this damage that's being done to the institutional fabric of the country right now, because everybody kind of lusting after getting rid of Trump, and they're willing to kind of run roughshod over some very important constitutional principles. But the idea that a committee in Congress could subpoena the lawyer for the White House and demand to know what the legal advice is that he or she gave to the president is defying a whole set of customs and procedures that have been established around the sanctity, if you will, of the privacy of these kind of consultations. So that's the status of it. So what I want to do is I want to go into some detail about, so you'll be familiar with exactly what it is that happened in the Dakota Access Pipeline case and what's getting ready to happen in the Keystone XL pipeline, because this is going to be the acid test of the level of effectiveness of the indigenous people here in North America to be able to stop a pipeline and to stop the added onus that it lends to global climate change.